Good evening and welcome to our conversation. This evening we have with us Reverend Kenyetta Chinwe, who is the Faith Advocacy Coordinator for Sister Song. Reverend Chinwe is a Black, queer, gender fluid woman of Caribbean heritage and a Florida native who has resided in Atlanta, Georgia, for the last 23 years. She's a singer, writer, actor, spiritual facilitator, daughter, sister, aunt, RJ educator, and all-around creative. For the last 3 years, she has been utilizing the skills she gained in faith-based leadership, the arts, and management to advance the work of reproductive justice as Sister Song's Faith Advocacy Coordinator, where she is also a founding member and interim steering committee co-chair of the Spiritual Alliance of Communities for Reproductive Dignity that works to shift culture through congregation and community education on reproductive health, rights, and justice. Her current call is to build a base of visible and vocal faith leaders and people of faith who openly support the cause of reproductive health, reproductive rights, reproductive access, and reproductive justice. Welcome, Reverend Kenyetta. We also have Reverend Alba Onofrio, who is the co-executive director of SoulForce. Reverend Alba is a Southern Appalachian, first-gen Latinx queer evangelical femme resistor who lives and loves in La Lucha with queer, trans, people of color folks as a spiritual healer and bruja troublemaker to subvert systems of domination, combat spiritual terrorism, reclaim the divine and the erotic, and eradicate shame and fear wherever they are found. They hold a Master of Divinity degree from Vanderbilt Divinity School, where their studies focused on the theologies of sex, embodiment of the divine in the queer colonized body, and sexual ethics based in queer desire. Alba has also worked in the immigrants' rights movement for over a decade, previously serving as the executive director of El Centro Hispano, the then largest non-religiously affiliated grassroots community center in North Carolina. As the former spiritual strategist for SoulForce and co-founder of the Sexual Liberation Collective, Reverend Sex continues to work for queer liberation all over the place, but most fondly in the US South and in solidarity with the global South. My name is Phillis Isabella Sheppard. I'm on the faculty at Vanderbilt Divinity School, and I'm also the director of the James Lawson Institute for the Research and Study of Nonviolent Movements. And I'm very happy to invite you to this conversation tonight that must be had and will be being held all over the place for some time to come post the Supreme Court's decision. This is a conversation, and I would like to just begin by asking our panelists to help us understand, how did we get here? What's the landscape that brought us to this conversation and brought us to the Supreme Court landing on this decision?
Good evening, everyone. First of all, let me say thank you so much for inviting me to be here. The truth of the matter is the historical moment that we're sitting in right now is a culmination of a 40-year culture campaign by a very small faction of religious people in our country. Before the 1970s, probably, you would have been kind of hard-pressed to find Protestants talking about abortion. It was seen as a Catholic issue, and it was mostly Catholic churches who were standing in opposition of reproductive rights being available to all. Most Protestant churches just didn't talk about it. It wasn't that they celebrated it, they just didn't talk about it. It just wasn't an issue. And then in the early 80s, when the white evangelical movement at the time was coming under fire for the segregation that was running rampant in their evangelical run schools, they were seeking ways to gain political power so as to defend themselves against these accusations. And they picked up this cause of quote unquote defending the unborn, a cause that is actually convenient without any accountability, because there's no one to hold you accountable when you're advocating for the unborn. But it was also an easily spread idea. It lent itself towards propaganda, this idea of innocent life. Basically, they used this as a wedge issue to gain political power, basically just to defend against the other egregious things that they wanted to do within our government. And so basically we get to this moment now, after 40 years of abortion being used as a political tool to gain political power. And in the course of that 40 years, as their power amassed, they were actually able to move candidates and move candidates who would actually one day be able to appoint judges to our Supreme Court, to our federal courts, and to our Supreme Court that would get us to this moment that we're in right now. So basically, we are seeing the end of a 40-year long game, unfortunately.
Reverend Alba.
Yeah, I think that's so incredibly important. That idea, one tidbit that helps me think about that is that in 1972, the Republican Party's public platform had 0 mentions of God in it. And by 1980, under Ronald Reagan, that moral majority had almost line by line, each basically argument that they were trying to make in politics was directly connected to something connected with religion. And I think it's so important, exactly what you were saying around recognizing this is a long game, because a lot of us have been asleep or not quite paying attention. My deepest hope that particularly the huge segment of white liberals who have thought that it was just a small fraction or a small faction that was, the extreme, now understand that they now run our country and have authority at the highest levels of power. And underneath that white supremacy, basically, that Reverend Kenyetta was just talking about, that was the strategy, was white supremacy, and abortion, as well as LGBT issues and other gender issues, got used as this excuse. And I want to take us back even farther, because how did we get here depends on how far back we want to go. Because if we recognize colonization and enslavement,
absolutely,
the idea of control, of governance of women's bodies, of all bodies that weren't specifically white, male, elite bodies, then we can recognize, we can keep backtracking to figure out how we got here. And I hope in that we can also understand what we need to start healing and addressing at a foundational ideological level before we can get to okay, how do we get Roe back? I don't think that's the most important question.
Absolutely. I totally concur. At the root of all of it is a white Christian nationalism that is unfortunately the bedrock of this country. Like you say, goes all the way back to colonization and slavery. So,
and sometimes we don't even recognize it, right? Sometimes we are complicit with it because we have heard the lies enough times that they seem like they are real, or that the Bible actually says whatever that thing that is that gets used.
That it doesn't.
And
right.
So that orientation feels like part of our work is, how do we learn what the Kool-Aid that we've been drinking, the poison that we've been intaking as if it were water and air, so that we can at least start to deconstruct it or interrupt it when we see it in our own lives, in our own communities, and all the way up to the top, of course.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you make the connection, you do the tracing not only of the connection all the way back to colonization. So Black and brown and poor bodies have always been governed and surveilled. And then you connect it with the long game. It really demonstrates or reveals that the work before us is on multiple levels. is on multiple levels. So using that long game image, it makes me wonder what might be coming down the road. So what is this connecting with? Are there any other things we can expect, not necessarily from the Supreme Court, but certainly from the Supreme Court, that might suggest that there are implications for other commitments and concerns?
Absolutely. You know, the fact of the matter is every citizen of the United States should be concerned about their civil and human rights at this point. And the reason that I say that is because this decision, when you read the way that this decision was written, basically calls into question who gets that equal protection under the law by the 14th Amendment. And so therefore, this concept of allowing states to make decisions about people's actual humanity and who gets protected by the Constitution has never been a good thing for Black and brown bodies. The fact of the matter is most of the decisions that have had to be made by the Supreme Court in our modern history, like in the 20th and 21st century, was in direct intervention to states making egregious laws that restricted people's lives and livelihood. So if we are now saying, oh, we're going to turn things back over to the states, what makes us think that it won't need that same intervention that initially caused, you know, the reason we have Roe v. Wade is because the states were not, you know, doing a service for everyone to be able to have access to the healthcare that they need. The reason we have Brown versus Board of Education is because schools were segregated all over the South and states were making those decisions, and the federal government had to say, hey, every child should have access to the same education. And so having a ruling that's putting everything back into the hands of the state, while simultaneously maintaining this authoritarian approach towards things like gun violence, is a recipe for disaster. It really, really is. And as someone who is queer, even though I am divorced, I understand that the long fought battle of marriage equality literally now hangs in the balance. It was specifically named in one of the dissenting comments. And so we would be naive to not think that that is something that is going to be targeted. Outside of that, the numerous amount of anti-trans youth laws that are popping up all over the country, if we start saying the states can do what they want, we are basically dooming a generation of trans children to be oppressed by the states in which they live in, and their parents maybe even being criminalized for caring for them in the way that they need to be cared for. So I think the implications are just wide-reaching for anyone who is not white, male, and cisgendered right now. Like they will come down your lane eventually.
And I think it's important, I hate to keep harking so far back, but it's not actually so far back, that the argument for states' rights from the very foundations of this nation were about maintaining a slaveocracy. And so I think that for a very long time, many of us have been kind of laughed at when we talked about how things like Title IX and other different things that came down the pike were still being combated because white elites were still pissed that they lost the Civil War and that they still were really working to keep that white supremacist majority in terms of power and resources and wealth. And I hope that now we can like lay that to rest as a question. It is very clear that white supremacy, white nationalism, white Christian supremacy is the driving factor behind all of these things. And it's not very hard to trace back. And so when we move to a states' rights, I grew up in Appalachia. I'm from the South. I believe in the South. And I grew up in a time where we understood that the Civil War was actually about states' rights versus federal overreach, not about slavery. That is what I was taught in white Appalachia, right? And so that continuing to be the false narrative that is taught to the majority of people when we understand that this is about, that we like states' rights because we should have the ability to govern ourselves locally, that language that is being used by the left and the right about governing locally is built on an infrastructure that harkens back to a time where white owning classes ruled everything under this guise, because the rest of us didn't have a right to vote. We didn't even have humanity, some of us, so the idea that we're throwing it back to the states because we have the right to govern ourselves locally is a lovely idea and thought, but we need to root it in history and also in what that actually means practically speaking. So also as a queer Southern Latina, I think it's important to recognize like those ideas of states governing ourselves are built on gerrymandering that happens in such intense ways that hold up state governments that continue to reinforce white supremacy. And exactly what you were saying, the federal government is meant to kind of level a baseline. And now that we don't have a baseline, or our baseline is so pro-religious right-wing extremism, I think we need to be paying attention, because as many, particularly Black Southern organizers have been saying for a generation, this is all getting back down to the ground from where this started, because those exact same rulings that were happening in the 60s and 70s, people are still mad about that. And maybe it wasn't polite for a while to talk about it, but now it feels like in this Trump era, it's
They've been
absolutely acceptable
empowered
to say, we're pissed and the white people need to get our shit together and take over whatever. And so that being the orientation, let us not pretend for 1 second that this is about abortion. This is about supremacy and control of many bodies by a few bodies, and that therefore means that this is an issue that is urgent to all of us, regardless of whether we want children, whether we need to have an abortion, whether we have a uterus, any of those things. That's not the point. And if we focus so much on that, which I think is important to talk about those issues, if we focus so much though on abortion, I think we're going to miss all of the other things that are just right on the backs, starting with trans access to healthcare and rights.
And Reverend Alba, I literally just said that phrase to someone today. It was and has never been about abortion, ever. Yeah. Abortion is the smokescreen that the Christian right used to gain political power. It was a tool. And so therefore, all of like the voter suppression and the gerrymandering that you are talking about came on the back of the pro-life movement. They got power so that they could do the things that they're doing now.
Right. And when abortion was like less popular, then it was the gays. And then now it's the trans folks. So it's like, it's whoever needs to be, at least in the case of North Carolina, we didn't have same-sex marriage. And yet we had this entire huge campaign to pass Amendment 1 to outlaw same-sex marriage, even though it was already illegal, because the Republican base needed mobilization because the economy was tanking and all of the other terribly managed like government infrastructure run by conservative right-wing Republicans in our state. So it's always a good issue to have in your pocket. It's like this Trump card that could be like, okay, yes, we're doing a terrible job in all of these things, but what about, and then you have, a few
what
of
about
those.
the dead babies? What about the gays?
Well, I hear all this, and it says, given that this decision came from the Supreme Court, you're basically, well, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but it almost sounds like you're saying that the Supreme Court is in bed with the strategy.
What I'm saying is,
you didn't say that, did you? Okay.
What I'm saying is that judges in the federal court system and in the Supreme Court system are appointed by administrations. So our federal and Supreme Court system always has a political leaning, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, because they are being appointed by administrations that have political leanings. What the place that we find ourselves in now is a result of legislators who had a specific end game in mind, who for the last 12 years basically have hijacked who and how someone gets appointed to the Supreme Court that has us in this position. The fact that they would not let Obama appoint a Supreme Court justice the whole time he was in there, even though it was his right as the president, gives you the example. Like, and so I'm not saying that I'm not saying anybody's in bed with anybody. I'm saying that the people who have power use that power to stack the court in their favor.
Mm.
Well, I'll say it then. I think that we live in a white supremacist nation, and people in power on all sides, liberal, progressive, Republican, whatever, we have embedded in us a white supremacist understanding of the world and a white supremacist understanding of Christianity. And I think it has been very direct and very clear that who gets put in place depends on how in line you fall with that. And whether it's liberal or conservative or extreme right wing, whoever you're trying to placate in order to get to a place that you need to be, I think you're exactly right. We're lying to ourselves if we pretend like the Supreme Court is apolitical. That's bullshit.
Absolutely.
We know that as human beings, we have certain things that we care about, and we can see in the confirmation hearings that just happened that it's not about your qualifications. It's about what groups people think that you're going to be more sympathetic to and how closely that aligns to whoever is the people giving you the power. And that being true means that until we are all very clear on where we came from and where we're going, then we are going to be in one way or another complicit with those systems of white supremacy. And we're going to have to keep working at it and fighting, particularly those of us on the left and in radical circles, on alternative strategies, both for our own care within communities, but also for how we tackle this beast. Because when so many folks don't even acknowledge that that is true, and that it is inherent in our laws, inherent in our structures, inherent in our biases, we're never going to be able to be actually, what is the word when you're not biased? Like the idea, I forget what the word is. I just lost it. Anyway, neutral. We're never neutral. Whether we're biased one way or biased another way, yes, thank you, objective. Like the idea of objectivity is a lie. And I think our wonderful peers in the psychology world have taught us enough to understand that whatever is considered status quo or normal is just about a dominant position and those in power to enforce that position as the norm. And so, yes, absolutely, Dr. Sheppard, they are in bed together.
Well, Reverend Alba, I didn't want to be the angry Black girl on record saying that that the Supreme Court was in bed with the powers that be, but I'm glad you did it for me.
We're in it together. We're in it together.
Oh, I wish the two of you would, and Alba, you brought this to my mind, but say a little bit more about gender. When Shatika and I were talking, one of the things that we kept yelling about is that so often, and certainly in this case, it is women's bodies who are being governed, surveilled, restricted. And we do not hear this same kind of attention, I'll say, destructive attention to white male bodies. Certainly we know with Black male bodies, brown male bodies. But how does that figure into this? How is it that we're often unaware that it really is Black and brown women's bodies that this battle is taking place on?
Well, if you'll let me jump in first.
Yeah, I'll let you start this time.
It all goes back to Genesis. I hate to be the nag that's like stuck in history. In fact, I hated history when I was a child, but now here I am. I think that the idea of Eve in the garden with the serpent, of Jezebel, of Delilah, of all of these figures that we get to pin culpability on, that needs to be redeemed, restored, taken care of by a parental figure, by a father, by a husband, redeemed by a son. All of that orientation fits so nicely together with patriarchy, with heteropatriarchy, with white European colonization of brown bodies and Black bodies and foreign bodies and savage bodies and native bodies, that paternalism that is embedded in the patriarchy is so much part of our Disney fairy tales about princesses that get kissed while they're unconscious, about girls who get rescued from poverty and then they become a princess and then they get to dominate other people's body. You know, it's so wrapped up in our lore and in our mythology and in our religion that we have somehow understood that to be morally acceptable, that we need to be cared for if we have bodies of value, or we need to be surveilled if we have bodies that are suspect. But in all cases, we need to be moderated in some ways, covered, because forever we inherit the sin of Eve in that we are lustful, sinful, ignorant, emotional, hysterical, fill in the laundry list of things. And it's so built into our culture and into our narratives of religion and society across all of Christendom that I think that we something has to click us out of that for us to even recognize. I was watching a video recently that was from the 70s, where a woman at the Republican conference national convention was saying most women don't want to be liberated from their condition as women and wife and mother and whatever. And so it's an important moment to recognize where we are in the history. And when that's glorified, we are wonderful mothers and suffering servants and et cetera, but always needing of somebody else above us.
Mm-hmm.
I really don't have a whole lot to add to that. I believe that everything that Reverend Alba said is correct. The only nuance that I would add is I am someone who claims Christianity, but I also claim other things as spiritual, and for my life. And it is very true that when the concept of femininity was moved from the concept of divinity, that we became expendable and were only for the service of men. But like in other traditions where feminine and masculine are honored in right relation, then women are not seen as disposable. They're not seen as only in service to men. They're not seen as having only value in their motherhood and in their wifedom. They're seen as actual human beings. And we live in a country, unfortunately, that claims as its root a Christian doctrine that has a paternal figure as the only divine. Even in the Trinity, it is all, the way we express the Trinity is as Father, Son, Holy Ghost, and all of them are male, and so there is no feminine expression of the divine that is ever fed to us. And that fuels this idea that we need someone to take care of us. And so therefore our bodies need to be surveilled because, the divine force who watches over us all made men in his image to watch over the women, so to speak.
And one of the most interesting things I've heard recently, I'm returning to Caliban and the Witch, a book that is dense but very necessary. I heard someone say recently that part of the work of white folk is remembering when the witches got burned, that severed the relationship of the feminine to the land, to the medicine, to the healing, and to the power of the women's space. And I apologize for using this kind of binary male female, but in the realm of the feminine, when white Europeans killed their women folk who were in charge of that balance with the land and with the medicine and the healing connected with their ancestors and their land, that is a spiritual wound that has followed wherever folks may go to find new land through their colonization. That wound and that missing piece is still present. And therefore, until we get at some of that wound, I'm half white. And so those of us who have white ancestry, until we work on some of those wounds that are ancient but still follow us, then we will not be able to really orient ourselves toward what a balance between like nature, God, humanity, creation, right relationship can actually look like.
Mm.
I absolutely agree with that, Reverend Alba. It's so funny because I actually was having a conversation with one of my white friends who's witchy, and I literally told her, I said, that is the white woman's work, is to make that connection, like to do that work, to heal that wound in y'all's lineage, like not necessarily always looking for other people's medicine, but going back and reclaiming y'all own,
That's right.
Mm. So how did it come to be that you all, you've both been talking about faith and spirituality. How did it come about that you have been able to, what's been your trajectory, your path, where faith was a source for you to integrate your own sense of gender, sexuality, reproductive health? How did that come together? Because on the one hand, I hear you both saying that religious philosophies, practices have really problematized women's bodies, have problematized sexuality, have problematized Black and brown existence. And but you're also, well, you're both reverend. So how, yeah.
Do you want me to start, Reverend Alba, or you want to start?
Either way.
You go.
Well, I was raised in the Southern Baptist tradition up here in Appalachia. And I think that the foundations that I was given as part of that tradition are the things that saved me spiritually, emotionally, in my process of coming out and doing justice work. And some of those foundational principles, like God was as close as my breath, Jesus loved me, for the Bible tells me so, do unto others, what God has created is marvelous and wonderful, a responsibility for others, for our salvation. Those narratives look a little bit different now. It looks more like ecofeminist justice. It looks more like queer liberation. It looks more like anti-capitalist politics. But those basic principles are what helped me understand when my church, when my family, when my school was telling me that I was an abomination. That small, still voice inside me, which I would call the erotic, said yes to a love and an exchange with someone else, with another woman, in a way that was so clear and so strong and so resounding for me that all of those no's of the world fell away in comparison. And I grew up wanting to be a stay-at-home mom with a whole bunch of kids, barefoot and pregnant. I went to a very fancy university and was the only person in my class who really wanted to just be a wife and mother. And I thank God for my queerness, because it was through that rupture that allowed me to start engaging in critical thinking around what I believed and what the implications of my belief are. And so for me, I think what is true for so many of us, the hypocrisy of the church in comparison to the religion that we believe in is so intense and is so problematic that we find these moments of rupture where we don't know what to do with ourselves, because we come from the church, we believe in Christianity, and then we are confronted with absolute hypocrisy at multiple levels, connected to gender, sexuality, finances, fill in the laundry list. And some of us step away, and I think that that's absolutely valid for whatever reasons we need. Some of us kind of squash whatever was alive in us that brought us those questions out of fear of being expelled or fear of not pleasing God, or et cetera, et cetera. And then there are those of us who decide to stay and fight. And for me, I put those things together because I was baptized Christian. I was baptized Catholic by my mother. I was baptized Southern Baptist by my father's family. And I believe that I am the product of generations of colonization and rape of our women on this continent. And they named me Christian. And therefore, this is for me, the absolute legitimate result of that kind of violence connected with religion. And therefore, no one can tell me that I am not Christian. We're going to have to make space within Christianity for those of us who understand a Christian faith within a political analysis, and not outside of a political analysis. And so for me, it is my faith that drives my activism. It is what drives this belief, and it's what allows me to see reality rather than the Disney religion idealism, which is what most of us are taught in church. And anytime we step out of that framework of like the ideal of like, no, everything's fine, everything's good, Jesus wants us, there is a boogeyman out there somewhere, but we just like name that the devil and keep moving toward justice, and all of that orientation, I think, is motivated by fear. And once those of us who are ejected because of our queerness, because of a divorce, because of an abortion, fill in a blank, whatever the things are, once we are expelled from that system, I hope that it gives us a little bit more perspective to critically engage how, in what formats, and under what power or control we're willing to engage that system. And so I feel like there, but by the grace of God go I could have been one of those fundamentalist Christians more easily than I could have been this, but here I am and feel so grateful to be here.
Ashe.
Okay.
Like you, my faith compels my activism. It is what is underneath it all. My journey is interesting. I was born into a faith community. My father was a Pentecostal preacher. My mother was the daughter of two Pentecostal preachers. Her father was a bishop in the denomination I grew up in, and her mother was an evangelist. My mother has 11 siblings. Of them, 6 are Pentecostal preachers. I have 3 siblings. 2 of my sisters are preachers in the Pentecostal faith. I am a Pentecostal girl. That is who I am at my core. And even as progressive as my faith gets, the parts of me that are steadfast and forward moving and trusting of something higher than myself comes from that Pentecostal root. And for me, the journey was, it was interesting. So I, probably around 13, I started this thing where I changed the way I prayed, in that it wasn't, oh, I had to kneel down, and I literally would look out the window at night before I went to bed at the moon, and I would talk to God. And when I came to the realization, like to the very clear realization when I was about 16 that I was same gender loving, it was hard, because it was like everything that I was told that God was and this thing that I'm discovering that I am are in total antithesis to each other. And how do I reconcile these two things? But what was always true is that when I looked out the window at the moon at night and I talked to God, I felt presence. And so I knew that no matter what, I could ask questions of my God and still be okay. I will say that came from the people who raised me. Even though my parents were Pentecostal, my dad was a man before his time. And so he never, there was never a crushing certainty, even though our denomination dealt in certitudes, my father never imposed that upon me. To give you a brief story, when I was 12 years old, I'm about to age myself right now. When I was 12 years old, I was watching an episode of Donahue where Shirley MacLaine was on Donahue talking about reincarnation. And after the episode, I asked my dad if he believed in reincarnation. And my Pentecostal father looked at me and said, well, you know, the tradition we believe in says that you live once and then there's judgment. He says, but I also believe in a sovereign God. And if he wanted to bring somebody back, he could do that too. And that is the way that I have always approached my faith, that God is sovereign. And so despite what we might think in the interpretation of the books that we read, there is always room for God to do things outside of that book. And so when I got to college, I was one of those people who stepped away from Christianity for a while. I kind of delved into I joke and say I experimented with religions like people do drugs in college. I was a different religion every 6 months because I was looking for a way to reconcile my faith with who I was. But in the end, I returned to Christianity because the thing that I found through my exploration is that there's a through line that exists through all faiths that I have experienced, which is love. Love God, love yourself, love your neighbor as yourself. When Jesus was asked what was the most important, that's what he said. And truthfully, that is the through line. And those tenets actually are what motivate me to do the work that I do in the world. My ethic of care and compassion that came from my Pentecostal upbringing will not allow for me to exist in a world that feels unjust for anybody. And so therefore I work for justice because that is what my faith compels me to. And I know that God loves me, however.
Ashe, ashe. Let me merge several questions going through my head. One is, one relates to direct action and one relates to, they're both the same question, I guess. What is the place of direct action in our responses to all the things that you've named, but certainly to the Supreme Court decision? And what should we be doing now? What should a divinity school be doing? A lot of the people that I've been on the phone with or texting with, that is the question. A combination of, all right, what now? And I'm tired. So we're in the context of the divinity school. What ought we to be doing?
Well, first of all, I acknowledge you're tired. It's a valid feeling. Things that I'm directing people to do, if it aligns with your values. Number one, donate to your local abortion funds or your regional abortion funds, because people will now more than ever need assistance probably to get care, because people will have to cross state lines and do all of that. That's one thing. Another thing that I am promoting heavily, especially in faith spaces, is to start these brave conversations like we're having right now. I am mentioned in my bio that I am one of the founding members and the interim steering committee chair for SACRED, which stands for Spiritual Alliance of Communities for Reproductive Dignity. And SACRED's main mission is to help congregations talk about reproductive rights, health, and justice. We have a 7-module curriculum that you can get trained in to take your congregation through, that literally talks about all the stuff that Alba and I talked about today, about the white supremacists, white nationalists, white Christian nationalism that is at the root of this, about the bodies that have been exploited, oppressed, and abused in the name of Christianity, but how you can still claim your faith by actually acknowledging this and doing advocacy in the here and the now, and not allowing people to steal your faith for oppression. And so if people want to learn about that, they can go to say, yes, thank you for dropping the link. It's sacreddignity.org. And then if you want to get into the fray, so to speak, and want to be a part of the fight, I would urge you to reach out to your local reproductive justice organizations who already have programming that they are actually implementing in this time. Also donate to them if you are not able to physically help. One thing that I know, if you want to get involved with Sister Song's work, please sign our justice statement for progressive people of faith. It's justfaithforajustworld.org, and you will get updates about the faith-based work that we do in this area. But get connected to people who are already doing the work is always my directive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I get behind all of those things. I think sometimes when big things like this happen, we have an urge to if we are already doing something connected to repro justice, for example, we have an urge to do something. And I want to just remind those of us who are not centered in the repro justice world that our siblings have been doing this work and organizing for so very long and doing such a very good and very hard job, that for me, for example, it's like what offerings do I have, whether those are financial resources or otherwise, and how do I get information? What is happening? And I think that's so incredibly pivotal. We at SoulForce, for example, look to Sister Song a lot as being a comrade organization here in the South and close to us. We're in North Carolina. And so those things, other things I'll just add to the list is if you are someone who struggles with I was raised pro-life. It wasn't even part of a conversation. It was just what was true. We believed in protecting babies and unborn and all these other things. And I think that's really important to educate ourselves, to understand when we're actually talking about abortion and when we are not, when we are actually talking about actually systems of domination, white supremacy, white nationalism, those kinds of things. And I think it's scary for those of us who fear finding information that call our faith into question. And so SoulForce has a couple of resources that might help that are free online to download. One is called Myths of the Pro-Life Movement. It was really helpful for me to know, for example, that in 1971, the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the kind of denomination I come from, actually passed a bill within their ranks to support the proactive work toward legislation that would allow for abortion in some cases, that the Catholic Church has flip-flopped back and forth about what it thinks about abortion, including having priests, in Europe write specific herbal manuals about how to help their women in their parishes end pregnancies that weren't desired. And so learning those kinds of facts really helped me create a little bit more space between institutions of religion that say that they speak for God about on this issue of abortion, but actually learning that it hasn't always been that way, and how many, 97% of people who seek abortions are actually Christian. These myths that tell us that we can't both be pro-reproductive justice and also be Christian. So I think confronting those is really important. And the other thing I would say for both people of faith and people who want to work with people of faith is not being scared to talk about what the right is using as leverage. For example, this idea that birth starts at conception. We have another resource called the decision that Mary made, or something like that. It's about Mary and this idea of biblical motherhood and this orientation toward Mary makes a decision starting with step 1, where the angel says, do not be afraid. Therefore, God doesn't want us to make these decisions out of fear. Mary gets to ask questions and get answers, has informed consent, gets to ask, how can this be possible that I'm going to have a baby? I haven't had sex with a man yet, which means she knows and understands how reproductive systems work, how pregnancy works, and therefore full access to sexual education in schools feels important. So it's kind of it is an intentionally biased look at, this is what all of us do when we interpret the Bible, is that we take the lenses and the knowledge we have and we apply it to the text that we read. And it's that kind of exercise, that kind of exegesis. And so I would encourage us to be honest about things we don't know. For example, does life start at the first breath? Does life start when the semen hits the egg? Does life start at the first trimester? It's okay to have the answer that I don't know. And therefore, I prioritize the beings that are alive in front of me with lives and families and other children, and making those really hard decisions, as opposed to this idea of purist ideals related to our faith, which I think is based in white supremacy and colonization, ultimately. So I think there's so many possibilities. Giving money is great. Taking a vacation, taking a break, particularly if you're in the middle of this fight, or if you're one of those bodies that is being governed, I think is also so important, because we're in this for a long haul. We've just been told this was a 40-year battle that got us to this day, right? It didn't happen overnight. And we need to understand that for at least the next couple of decades, this country is going to be run by white supremacists, including at the highest levels of government, including the Supreme Court. And therefore, we need to be prepared for this long-term battle. But if we're thinking 7 generations, we need to make sure that we're attending to our own spirits, that we are finding our our crews, whoever those are, whether those are your sisters in faith, whether those are your comrades in the politics, whether that's your family, whether that's your community of faith, whatever those things are that help sustain us and fortify us, because we can't all burn hot right now. We are dependent on each other for the generations that are to come, including our own, the rest of our own lives. And it's a long haul battle. And it's one that is ideological as much as it is legislative. And so I think for the Divinity School, I am so grateful for this kind of conversation. I think being willing to tackle the theological conversations that often end, as I learned at Vanderbilt, in more questions. Dr. Dale Andrews would always say, I have more questions than answers, and of these I freely give and share. That I think is a very beautiful orientation, to be honest, that we don't always know the answers, but that does not mean that it isn't very much worth doing the theological work to be in conversation with each other and to recognize what bodies are being cared for or saved and what bodies are not being cared for, and making, our own decisions around how we get involved based on that.
Ashe, I would like to just reiterate what Reverend Alba said about having more questions than answers. My liberation as a faithful person, even before I was clergy, was being okay with the questions. And I think if we can teach anything to our faithful people, our faith congregations, our seminarians, our divinity students, is that it's okay to not know, and that God lives just as well in the questions as he does in the answers. So.
Oh, thank you both so much. Just you both have been talking about the importance of conversation, dialogue. We've heard about brave space, and not being afraid to be afraid or scared, but being willing to open yourself to your questions. I think the final question I have is, what have you learned about being in conversational spaces with those who want to be in conversation, but adamantly are in a different position? Whether you decide to be in those spaces or find yourself in those spaces. Preferably you decide, but there are times.
I'm going to tell you what has happened to me recently that has actually been a check for me. That has been a check for me as an activist who does this reproductive justice work. After the leak happened, I had several family gatherings, kind of in rapid succession. And in my own bias, I assumed that I knew what my family's position would be, and ended up having conversations with my sisters and my aunts, and realized that more of them understood the concept of autonomy than I realized. My sister literally said to me, I went to her house for Mother's Day, and as we were conversing about this, she looked at me and she says, you know that I do not believe in abortion. She says, it's not something I've ever believed in. She says, but I also don't think it's ever a good idea for the government to tell anybody what to do with their body. And I was floored. And it's a conversation I never actually even broached with my sister, because I already assumed what her position is. So I think for me, what the lesson that I'm getting right now is to enter every conversation from a space of compassion, because just because you think you know what somebody believes, they may not necessarily believe that. And if you can find a way to relate to something that they can connect to, even if it's in direct opposition to what their belief is, you might be able to have a conversation. My sister does not believe in abortion. She does not believe anybody should have one. But as a Black woman who lives in America, who understands that it has never been a good thing for the government to control our bodies, she stands on that side. She stands on the side of everybody should be able to make that decision for themselves, because she understood the slippery slope it is for the government controlling a Black body. And so I think finding somewhere that you can find a common ground with someone can open up the conversation for a broader expression.
What a powerful story. I've had similar experiences recently where I realized how even in the most conservative communities that I'm in, being in Appalachia, for example, we are generally very hostile toward politics in general. And so I've been surprised how many folks just feel like I don't trust any of them. That orientation, which I actually think is, you know, I feel devastated by Roe falling, and being so deeply in community with our activists and feminists in Latin America who are fighting so hard for their own laws around bodily autonomy, and the impact, the kind of cascade that happens when we make a decision like this. What happens to our southern neighbors is even more intense. It kind of amplifies as it goes, particularly with the resources that the far right puts into the evangelical and Catholic spheres in Latin America. So I don't want to minimize that for one second. What I do think is true is that for many of us, we never had access to abortion to begin with. And it was in name only that we had that. And for those of us who live in certain states, for those of us who are part of certain communities, for those of us who are isolated in certain ways, I think that it was an ideal that was important, but I think that there is a moment of rupture and breaking apart that for some of us feels like it might be the end of the world, but I think creates this liminal space of trying to figure out, you know, some of the folks that I know who are the most faithful folks and also some of the most conservative folks I know deeply care about human beings and the status of the world, and particularly our country, which is about as big as the world gets for many of them and us in this country, of there being so much hostility, of there being an insurrection on, you know, January 6th, that those kinds of things that are happening, the gun violence that are happening, those things are not disconnected. And the meme, I know it's silly to say this, but the meme that gives me the most peace that I saw on Facebook months ago was saying the thing about oppression is that it's all interconnected. So if I tap on the web over here fighting my fight, and you tap on the web over there fighting your fight, we can guarantee that those are connected. And so just as we can connect all of the pieces between white settler colonialism and repro justice and immigrants' rights and trans healthcare, like we can do that work and do it really well. And that can be overwhelming with despair. What I find on the other side is that particularly in communities of faith, if we hold to the principles that we say we believe in as Christians, there is so much space to maneuver, especially when we are not assigning those a political affiliation. So I think some of the things that I'm learning is like, I actually don't give a shit about the Democratic Party or the Democrats in general. I don't even believe in a two-party system. And therefore, being able to just be honest that I don't trust those damn politicians either, which makes me a very middle of the road Appalachian person, I think is the beginning of saying, okay, can we center human beings? Can we center this story or that story or this story until those stories no longer become the exceptions, but rather part of the tapestry of a whole? And that gives me hope. And that gives me somewhere to start, exactly like you were saying, about this orientation towards what do we have in common? And in faith, we are lucky to have a collective belief in, you know, the care of ourselves, the care of others, belief in divine will and justice for all of us.
Listen, I want to thank you both for this conversation. We didn't know how it would go, what would come up really, and once you got started, but you have touched on all the things that have been on our hearts and minds. I want to quote Jen Bailey here, who says, "This conversation has been such a gift. Thank you for giving freely of your experience and wisdom and your questions." And we know that there are more questions and more conversations that we need to have. In fact, these conversations, I think, need to be our practice, our spiritual practice, part of them. Before we leave, I particularly want to thank, her face isn't on here, Shatika Brown, who got fired up and pulled us all together in such a wonderful way. And Shatika, I don't know why you're not showing your face, but thank you. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you, Shatika. We love you so very much.
Yes, thank you so much.
Before we leave, just quickly look at the chat where folks are writing in and thanking you all for being here. So please take those in and continue to be held in the light as you do the work you're doing, and that we all need to be held in the light as we do the work that we're all doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.